The moon's surface was a graveyard of smoke and ash, littered with the remains of a deadly battle. Shattered weapons, burnt-out vehicles, and the lifeless bodies of Syra's squad lay scattered under the crimson sky. The Zurhan Collective's drones hovered overhead, scanning for survivors. Syra, a warrior of the proud T-Core race, lay hidden in the twisted wreckage of her crashed ship. Blood seeped from her wounds, and her breaths came shallow and labored. She clutched the hilt of her blade, prepared to die with honor if the enemy found her. The Zurhan Collective was ruthless, and Syra knew mercy was not in their nature. They had ambushed her team, slaughtering her comrades in a brutal display of power. She was the last one alive, and her time was running out. The pain in her side was unbearable, but she gritted her teeth. Her pride would not let her beg for help, not that anyone was coming. A faint sound reached her ears, barely audible over the crackling of distant fires. Footsteps, light but deliberate. Someone, or something, was approaching. Syra tightened her grip on the blade, forcing her body to remain still despite the searing pain. She would strike the moment the enemy revealed themselves. The figure stepped into view, silhouetted against the flickering light of a nearby explosion. It wasn't a Zurhan drone. The shape was wrong, too clunky, too human. Syra's sharp eyes, even weakened by blood loss, caught the distinctive outline of a scavenger's suit. The figure crouched low, moving cautiously, as if searching for something among the debris. Ethan Walker had seen his fair share of war zones, but this moon was unlike anything he had encountered. The Zurhan Collective left nothing behind but ruin, their drones circling like vultures. Ethan's battered scavenger suit beeped softly, alerting him to faint energy signatures nearby. He adjusted his helmet's visor, scanning the wreckage. "Just another dead field," he muttered, his voice muffled by the helmet. He didn't care much about who had fought or why. He was here for parts, anything valuable enough to trade for supplies. His cloaking patch flickered faintly, masking him from the drones above. He didn't have much time before the power source ran dry. As he moved closer to the ship, the faint signal grew stronger. It wasn't just machinery. His visor picked up a life form, barely alive. Ethan hesitated. A survivor meant trouble. If it was a Zurhan, he'd have to put it down fast and quietly. If it was someone else, well, he didn't have the resources to save anyone. Still, curiosity tugged at him. He climbed over the wreckage, peering into the shadows. His helmet's light beams swept across the twisted interior of the ship, and then he saw her. The alien woman was slumped against a piece of jagged metal, her body limp, but her eyes sharp with defiance. She stared at him, unblinking, her blade raised weakly in a trembling hand. "Easy there," Ethan said, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Syra's vision swam, but she forced herself to stay alert. The human's voice was calm, almost casual. She didn't trust it. Humans were weak, opportunistic scavengers. What would one of them want with her? "Leave," she rasped, her voice barely audible. Ethan ignored her. He knelt down, pulling a med kit from his pack. "You're bleeding out. Let me help, or you're not making it out of here." "I don't need your help," she hissed, though the words lacked conviction. "Yeah, well, your body disagrees," Ethan shot back. He moved quickly, applying a pressure bandage to her wound despite her protests. She was too weak to stop him. The sound of a drone's engine echoed nearby, growing louder. Ethan froze, glancing up. The cloaking patch wouldn't last much longer. He glanced back at Syra. She was in no condition to move on her own. "Great," he muttered. "This is gonna get me killed." Without another word, he hoisted Syra onto his shoulders. She gasped in pain but didn't have the strength to resist. Ethan adjusted her weight, his muscles straining under the effort, and began moving toward the nearest cave system. The drones were closing in, their mechanical hum sending shivers down his spine. Syra's mind swirled with confusion and frustration. This human, this scavenger, had no reason to risk his life for her. Why was he doing this? Her pride screamed at her to push him away, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't deny the truth. She owed her survival to him. The entrance to the cave loomed ahead, hidden behind a jagged outcropping of rocks. Ethan ducked inside just as the drone's searchlight passed overhead. He set Sarah down gently, leaning her against the cool stone wall. "Stay quiet," he whispered, pressing a finger to his helmet. The drone hovered outside, its scanning beam sweeping the area. Ethan held his breath, his hand hovering over the small plasma cutter strapped to his belt. Minutes passed like hours, but the drone eventually moved on. He exhaled slowly, relaxing slightly. Zyra watched him closely. His movements were precise, practiced. He wasn't just a scavenger. This human had seen combat before. She hated to admit it, but he wasn't as pathetic as she had imagined. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, her voice softer than before. Ethan glanced at her, removing his helmet to reveal a face marked by scars and weariness. "Yeah, well, I've got this thing about not letting people die when I can help it. Call it a flaw." She didn't respond, but something about his words struck a chord. The T-Corps valued honor above all else, yet here was a human, risking his life for a stranger without expecting anything in return. It didn't make sense. Ethan rummaged through his pack, pulling out a small ration bar and handing it to her. "Eat, you'll need your strength." Zyra hesitated before taking it. The taste was bland, but it filled the gnawing void in her stomach. "You've got some fight in you," Ethan said, leaning back against the wall. "I respect that. But next time, maybe don't pick a fight with someone trying to save your life." Her lips twitched in what might have been the hint of a smile. "And maybe next time, don't underestimate a T-Corps warrior." Ethan chuckled softly. "Noted." The two sat in silence, the tension between them slowly easing. Outside, the war raged on, but in that small cave, an unlikely alliance was beginning to form. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: they would need each other to survive. Styra sat propped against the cave wall, her sharp eyes following Ethan's every move. He was busy tinkering with a device he had pulled from his pack, muttering to himself as if she wasn't there. Despite her weakened state, she couldn't shake the discomfort she felt in his presence. Humans were supposed to be insignificant scavengers, desperate for survival in a galaxy far beyond their capabilities. Yet this one had not only saved her life, but seemed entirely at ease in the middle of a war zone. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice still hoarse but laced with suspicion. Ethan glanced up briefly, raising an eyebrow. "Fixing this." He held up a small battered device that looked like it had been pieced together from a dozen different machines. "It's a cloaking patch. The one I used earlier is almost fried, and unless you want those drones finding us, I need this thing working." She frowned, not fully understanding his explanation. The T-Corps didn't rely on patchwork tools or improvised gadgets. Their technology was advanced, elegant, and reliable. Nothing like the mess of wires and circuits Ethan was handling. "Why not use proper cloaking tech?" she asked, her tone edged with disdain. Ethan snorted, not bothering to look at her this time. "Proper tech costs money, and humans like me don't exactly have the luxury of strolling into a T-Corps armory. We make do with what we have." His words stung more than she expected. The T-Corps were a proud and powerful race, but hearing the bitterness in his voice made her realize how others viewed them: aloof, unapproachable, and entirely self-serving. Still, her pride wouldn't let her show sympathy. "I see," she said simply, shifting slightly to ease the pain in her side. Ethan sighed, setting the device down for a moment, and leaning back against the opposite wall. "Look, I get it. To you, humans are probably just scavengers who barely scrape by. But out here, we don't have a choice. We're not stronger or faster, and we don't have shiny ships with cloaking systems. We survive because we adapt. That's what we do best." She studied him carefully, noting the lines of exhaustion on his face and the scars that hinted at a life of constant struggle. There was something different about him, something that set him apart from the arrogant image she had of humans. "You speak of survival as if it's something to be proud of," she said, her tone softer now. "But what of honor? What of legacy?" Ethan chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Honor doesn't mean much when you're dead. Legacy, that's for people with something to lose. Me, I just try to make it through the day." His words struck a nerve. The T-Core valued honor above all else, believing it to be the measure of a life well lived. But here was a man who had no use for such ideals, and yet he had saved her, a complete stranger, at great risk to himself. Before she could respond, the faint hum of a drone echoed through the cave. Ethan tensed immediately, grabbing his plasma cutter and switching off the small light he had been using. The darkness enveloped them, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The drone's scanning beam swept across the cave entrance, illuminating the jagged rocks for a brief moment. Sarah held her breath, her muscles taut despite the pain. She could sense Ethan's focus, his body coiled like a spring, ready to act if necessary. The drone lingered for what felt like an eternity before moving on, its hum fading into the distance. Ethan exhaled softly, relaxing slightly but keeping his plasma cutter close. "That was close," he muttered, glancing at Sarah. "You okay?" She nodded, though her pride wouldn't let her admit how vulnerable she felt. "I am fine." Ethan smirked faintly, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to argue. He returned to his makeshift workstation, resuming his repairs. As the minutes passed, the tension between them began to ease, replaced by a grudging curiosity. Zira watched him work, fascinated despite herself. His movements were precise, almost methodical, and she realized that his patchwork tools and gadgets were more sophisticated than they appeared. "You're good at this," she said finally, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks, I guess. You pick up a thing or two when your life depends on it." She hesitated before asking, "Did you always live like this?" Ethan paused, his expression hardening slightly. "Not always. I used to be a soldier, fought for the human colonies against the Zuran collective." Zyra's eyes widened slightly. "A soldier? And now you scavenge." He shrugged, his tone neutral. "The war didn't go well for us. Most of my squad didn't make it. After that, I figured I'd do better on my own." His words carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. The T-Core valued loyalty and camaraderie, but Ethan's story suggested a different kind of strength, the ability to endure loss and keep moving forward. "I lost my squad as well," she admitted quietly, surprising herself with the confession. "They were ambushed by the Zuran. I was the only one left." Ethan's gaze softened, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink. "Then you know what it's like," he said simply. She nodded, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable but shared, a mutual understanding born of shared pain. The sound of another drone in the distance broke the moment, pulling them back to the reality of their situation. Ethan finished repairing the cloaking patch and held it up triumphantly. "Good as new," he said, grinning. Zyra raised an eyebrow. "That is your solution to our problem?" It works," he replied, securing the patch to his suit. "Besides, it's better than sitting here waiting for those drones to find us." She couldn't argue with that. Despite her doubts, she was beginning to see the value in his resourcefulness. The T-Core relied on their superior technology and training, but Ethan's ability to improvise and adapt was something she couldn't ignore. As they prepared to move deeper into the cave system, Sarah found herself wondering if perhaps there was more to humans than she had given them credit for. Ethan might not have the honor or legacy she valued, but his determination and ingenuity were undeniable. For the first time since the ambush, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility that the galaxy's underdogs might be stronger than anyone realized. The air in the cave was cold and heavy, but Sarah's mind was sharper now, her body slowly recovering thanks to the human's rudimentary first aid. Ethan adjusted the straps of his pack and looked out toward the cave entrance, where the faint glow of Zurhan drones still lit the horizon. "We can't stay here," he said, breaking the silence. "These caves might shield us for now, but once they send ground units, it's game over. We need a plan." Zyra adjusted her position, the pain in her side still present, but no longer debilitating. "I agree, but what exactly is your plan, human? Run until we're cornered." Ethan smirked as he secured the repaired cloaking patch onto his suit. "You're welcome to come up with something better, warrior princess, but if you want to survive, you might want to listen for a change." Her sharp glare would have been intimidating to most, but Ethan seemed immune. Still, she remained silent, allowing him to explain. "We need to reach the northern ridge," Ethan began, pointing to a rough map he had pulled up on his visor. "There's a communications outpost there, old tech, but functional. If I can hack it, I can send a distress signal." "To whom?" Zyra asked, skeptical. "The Zurhan have already overrun this sector. No one is coming." "Not for you," Ethan replied matter-of-factly. "But humans have allies scattered around. Some owe me favors. If I can get a signal out, I might be able to get us a ride off this rock. If you got better friends, feel free to call them instead." She clenched her jaw, hating how casually he dismissed her people. But the reality was undeniable. The T-Corps had written her and her squad off the moment they fell. Their honor dictated that the dead were mourned, not rescued. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "But if we do this, we need to be smart. Those drones will detect movement as soon as we leave the cave." Ethan nodded. "That's where the cloaking patch comes in. It won't cover both of us, but it'll mask my movements long enough to scout ahead. I'll disable any surveillance units I can and clear a path. You'll follow when it's safe." Zyra frowned. "And what happens if you get caught?" Ethan grinned, his confidence infuriating. "I don't plan on getting caught. Besides, I've got a knack for talking my way out of trouble." She doubted that very much, but arguing was a waste of time. "Very well," she said. "Lead the way, human. I'll follow, if you don't get yourself killed first." Ethan gave her a mock salute before activating the cloaking patch. His form shimmered and disappeared, leaving only faint footprints in the dust as he moved toward the cave entrance. Zyra's sharp ears caught the faint hum of his suit's power source, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. For all his bravado, the human was stepping into grave danger. Ethan moved quickly and quietly, his years of scavenging and survival kicking in. The cloaking patch wasn't perfect. It flickered occasionally, and any major energy surge would reveal his position. Still, it gave him an edge. The Zurhan drones hovered nearby, their metallic frames sleek and deadly. Ethan crouched behind a boulder, pulling a small EMP grenade from his belt. He primed the device, counting down silently before lobbing it toward the nearest drone. The explosion was small but effective. Sparks flew as the drone's systems shut down, its lifeless body crashing to the ground. Ethan moved swiftly, dismantling the drone and salvaging its power core. He stuffed it into his pack, muttering to himself, "Never know when you'll need one of these." Back in the cave, Zyra waited, her muscles tense. Every sound made her grip the hilt of her blade tighter. She hated being sidelined, relying on someone else to ensure her safety. But as much as she loathed to admit it, the human was proving himself capable. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan's voice crackled softly through the small comm unit he had given her. "Clear for now. Move fast and stay low." Zyra pushed herself to her feet, her movements stiff but determined. She slipped out of the cave, scanning the terrain. The destroyed drone caught her attention, and she couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for Ethan's handiwork. She followed his trail, her steps silent despite the rocky terrain. The two met up behind a ridge, Ethan leaning casually against a rock, as if he hadn't just risked his life. "Not bad, huh?" he said, his grin infuriatingly smug. "You made too much noise," she replied, though her tone lacked venom. Ethan shrugged. "You're welcome." The two continued their journey, alternating between bursts of speed and careful stealth. Ethan's knowledge of the terrain was impressive, and Sarah began to see the merit in his approach. He avoided open spaces, stuck to natural cover, and disabled drones with precision. As they moved, Sarah began to ask questions, not out of curiosity, but strategy. "Why do you carry so many tools? Wouldn't it be easier to travel light?" Ethan chuckled. "You Tukor really don't know how to improvise, do you? Every tool I carry has saved my life at least once. Light is good, but prepared is better." She couldn't argue with his logic. The Tukor rarely needed to improvise. Their technology was always reliable. But out here, on this desolate moon, Ethan's adaptability was keeping them alive. The sun was beginning to set when they reached a narrow gorge. Ethan paused, scanning the area with his visor. "The outpost is just beyond this ridge," he said. "But there's a catch." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of catch?" "Zurhan Patrol," he replied grimly. "They've got ground units stationed around the outpost. Too many for a direct approach." She frowned, her warrior instincts kicking in. "Then we fight." Ethan shook his head. "We don't stand a chance in open combat, but we might be able to outsmart them." He pointed to a cluster of boulders near the patrol. "If I can rig an explosive charge there, it'll create a distraction. While they're dealing with that, we slip through the perimeter and reach the outpost." Zyra hesitated. The Tukor prided themselves on their combat prowess, not trickery. But the human's plan was sound, and she couldn't deny the logic. "Do it," she said finally. "But if your plan fails, I will not hesitate to fight." Ethan smirked. "Noted." As he worked to set up the explosive, Zyra kept watch, her blade ready. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but no drones or patrols appeared. The charge was set, and Ethan motioned for her to take cover. He triggered the device, and a deafening explosion shook the ground. Dust and debris filled the air as Zurhan soldiers rushed to investigate. "Move," Ethan hissed, and the two sprinted toward the outpost. They'd reached the perimeter just as the chaos subsided, slipping through an opening in the patrol's formation. Inside, the outpost was old and barely functional, but Ethan wasted no time accessing the comm system. "Let's hope this thing still works," he muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. Zyra stood guard, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this human wasn't as weak as she had thought. The comm system flickered to life, sputtering static and distorted signals. Ethan leaned in, his hands working feverishly to stabilize the connection. Zyra stood near the entrance, her blade gleaming faintly in the dim light of the outpost. Her sharp eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of Zurhan patrols, but the uneasy silence around them made her restless. "This thing's a relic," Ethan muttered, frowning at the outdated interface. "Half the circuits are fried, and the encryption is ancient. It's like trying to send a message with a rock and some string. Then work faster." Zyra snapped. "The distraction won't hold them off for long." Ethan smirked, but didn't argue. "Relax, warrior princess. I've got this." She bristled at his casual tone, but before she could retort, the comm system emitted a high-pitched whine and settled into a steady hum. A faint transmission crackled through the speakers, distorted but intelligible. "This is Echo Base," a gruff voice said. "Identify yourself." Ethan leaned closer to the microphone. "This is Ethan Hayes. I need immediate extraction from Sector 12. I've got hostile Zurhan forces in pursuit and a high value. Ally with me." He glanced at Zyra, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The line went silent for a moment. Then the voice returned, cautious and cold. "Ethan Hayes, you're supposed to be dead." "Yeah. Well, I didn't get the memo," Ethan shot back. Now, are you going to help, or do I have to start naming all the favors your people owe me? Another pause, then a heavy sigh. Extraction coordinates. Ethan quickly relayed their position, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Thyra listened closely, her instincts telling her something was off. The exchange felt too easy, too convenient. They'll come, Ethan said confidently as he stepped away from the console. Might take a while, but they'll come. Thyra frowned. And you trust them? Not even a little, Ethan admitted, shrugging. But desperate times, right? She didn't like his answer, but there was no time to argue. The distant hum of Zurhan drones grew louder, signaling the end of their brief reprieve. They're coming, Thyra said, gripping her blade tightly. Ethan nodded, his casual demeanor replaced by sharp focus. Then we hold them off until our ride gets here. The first wave of drones appeared over the ridge, their scanning beams sweeping the terrain. Thyra moved like a shadow, slicing through the nearest machine with precision. Ethan followed her lead, using his plasma cutter to disable another drone before it could sound an alarm. The two fought side by side, their movements strangely synchronized despite their differences. Thyra's fluid, deadly strikes complemented Ethan's quick, resourceful tactics. For a moment, it felt like they might actually survive. But then the Zurhan soldiers arrived, tall and imposing. Their metallic armor gleamed under the pale light of the moon. They'd moved with military precision, their weapons trained on the outpost. Thyra cursed under her breath, realizing they were outmatched. Inside, Ethan yelled, dragging her back toward the outpost. They barricaded the entrance as best they could, but the sound of Zurhan weapons firing against the door made it clear the defenses wouldn't hold for long. Ethan paced the small room, his mind racing. We need another way out. There isn't one, Thyra replied, her voice grim. This outpost is a relic. It wasn't designed for escape. Great, Ethan muttered. We're sitting ducks. The comm system crackled to life again, interrupting their argument. Hayes, the gruff voice said, we've got your position. ETA, 10 minutes. Make it 5, Ethan snapped. We've got Zurhan soldiers knocking on our door. The voice didn't respond, and Ethan slammed his fist against the console in frustration. Thyra watched him carefully, noting the tension in his posture. You've done this before, she said, her tone curious. Survived impossible situations, he replied with a bitter laugh. More times than I care to count. No, she said, shaking her head. This, calling for help, relying on others. Do they always come through for you? Ethan hesitated, his expression darkening. Not always. The sound of the barricade buckling under Zurhan fire snapped them both back to reality. Thyra tightened her grip on her blade, ready to fight to the end if necessary. But then Ethan's visor beeped, displaying a new signal. He froze, staring at the readout in disbelief. What is it? Thyra demanded. Not good, he said, his voice low. The extraction team. It's a trap. Her eyes narrowed. Explain. They're not here to save us, Ethan said, his tone bitter. They're here to collect. And I'm guessing they won't be too happy to see you. Thyra's blood ran cold. You betrayed me. Not intentionally, Ethan said quickly. I didn't know they'd pull this. They must have intercepted the Zurhan transmissions and decided to make a deal. She glared at him, her anger barely contained. So we're surrounded. By enemies and supposed allies. What now, human? Ethan's mind raced. He had faced bad odds before, but this was on another level. Still, he wasn't about to give up. We improvise, he said, grabbing a small device from his pack. What is that? Thyra asked, eyeing the device warily. An insurance policy, he replied. If they want us, they'll have to work for it. He placed the device near the comm system, programming it quickly. Thyra watched him, torn between fury and reluctant trust. What does it do? She asked. Ethan smirked. It makes sure no one gets what they want. The comm system, the data, the outpost, it all goes up in flames. And us. We get out, he said firmly. There's a maintenance hatch in the floor. It's small, but it'll lead us to the lower caverns. From there, we can lose them. Ahira didn't like the plan, but she saw no other option. She nodded, and the two worked quickly to set their escape in motion. As the Zurhan soldiers breached the barricade and the extraction team arrived on the ridge, Ethan activated the device. A low hum filled the room, followed by a countdown. "Time to go," he said, pulling Syra toward the hatch. They slipped into the narrow tunnel just as the device detonated, a blinding explosion consuming the outpost above them. The ground shook violently, and debris rained down, but the two pressed on, driven by sheer determination. In the darkness of the caverns, Syra finally spoke. "You risked everything to save yourself. Why?" Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Because sometimes survival is all that matters. But you're starting to make me think there's more to it." She didn't respond, but a small part of her couldn't help but wonder if he was right. The cavern walls trembled as the shockwaves from the explosion rippled through the underground passage. Dust and debris fell around them, but Ethan and Syra pressed on, their breaths labored, each step echoing in the confined space. Ethan held a small light to guide them, its faint glow flickering against the jagged walls. "Keep moving," he urged, glancing over his shoulder at Syra. "If they survive that blast, they'll be coming after us." "I don't run," Syra replied, her tone cold and resolute. "If they come, we fight." Ethan sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Yeah, well, unless your blade suddenly turns into a tank, we're not winning a direct fight. Survival first, revenge later." Syra didn't respond, but the firm grip on her weapon said enough. She wasn't running from a fight. She was stalking it, waiting for the right moment. Ethan just hoped her stubbornness wouldn't get them both killed. The passage opened into a vast subterranean chamber, its ceiling stretching high above them. Strange bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie blue light across the rocky terrain, revealing an ancient, abandoned structure nestled against the far wall. "What is that?" Syra asked, her sharp eyes narrowing as she scanned the structure. "Old mining facility," Ethan said. "Humans used to dig deep into these moons before the Zurhans scared everyone off. Looks like this one's been out of commission for years." "It's defensible," Syra observed. "We can make a stand here." Ethan shook his head. "We need to keep moving. If the Zurhan or those so-called allies track us here, we'll be cornered." "You said it yourself," Syra countered. "Survival first. This facility might have resources we can use, supplies, weapons, even a way to contact reinforcements. We stay, and we fight on our terms." Ethan hesitated, torn between her logic and the gnawing sense of urgency to keep moving. Finally, he relented with a sigh. "Fine, but if this goes south, I'm blaming you." They approached the facility cautiously, their movements silent. The entrance was partially collapsed, but they managed to squeeze through a narrow gap in the rubble. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of rust and decay. Ethan's light swept over the interior, revealing rows of long-abandoned equipment and crates. He approached a control terminal, brushing off a thick layer of dust before powering it up. The screen flickered weakly, displaying corrupted files and error messages. "Can you make it work?" Syra asked, standing guard near the entrance. "Maybe," Ethan replied, his fingers flying over the keypad. "Most of this is ancient tech, but if I can access the power grid, we might be able to get some defenses online." Syra nodded, her attention focused on the shadows outside. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the cavern, growing louder. She turned to Ethan, her voice low and urgent. "They're coming." Ethan cursed under his breath, redoubling his efforts at the terminal. "Buy me some time," he said, his tone unusually serious. "And whatever you do, don't let them inside." Syra didn't need to be told twice. She slipped out of the facility, blending into the shadows as the first Zuran soldiers entered the chamber. Their metallic armor gleamed in the dim light, their movements precise and calculated. Zara struck swiftly, her blade slicing through the first soldier's neck before he could react. She moved like a phantom, her strikes silent and deadly. But the Zurhan were no strangers to combat, and they quickly adapted, raising their weapons and firing at her position. Inside the facility, Ethan worked frantically, sweat dripping down his face as he bypassed the terminal's security protocols. The system finally responded, powering up the facility's long-dormant defenses. Rusty turrets whirred to life, their targeting systems locking onto the Zuran soldiers outside. "Got it," Ethan shouted, his voice echoing through the facility. The turrets opened fire, their heavy rounds tearing through the Zuran ranks. Zyra took advantage of the chaos, her blade flashing as she cut down the remaining soldiers. The chamber fell silent once more, the only sound the faint hum of the facility's power grid. Zyra re-entered the facility, her armor stained with Zuran blood. "Efficient," she said, nodding at the turrets. "Don't get used to it," Ethan replied, still catching his breath. "Those things are running on borrowed time. If we don't get out of here soon, we're toast." Before Zyra could respond, the ground shook violently, a deep rumble reverberating through the cavern. Ethan's eyes widened as he checked the terminal sensors. "They're bringing reinforcements," he said grimly. "Big ones." "What kind of reinforcements?" Zyra asked, her tone cautious. Ethan didn't answer immediately, but the look on his face said enough. "Mechs," he said finally. "Zurhan combat mechs. If they get here, we're done." Zyra tightened her grip on her blade, her jaw set. "Then we make our stand here. Together." Ethan glanced at her, surprised by her words. He nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. Together. They worked quickly, preparing the facility for the final battle. Ethan scavenged what he could from the crates, rigging explosives and makeshift traps. Zyra fortified the entrance, using debris to create a choke point. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the cavern, growing louder with each passing moment. The ground trembled as the first mech appeared, its towering frame casting a long shadow over the chamber. Ethan triggered the traps, a series of explosions rocking the cavern and damaging the mech's legs. It stumbled but didn't fall, its weapons firing wildly at the facility. Zyra charged forward, her blade slicing through the mech's exposed joints. Sparks flew as she dismantled its weapon systems, her movements precise and relentless. Ethan provided cover, using his plasma cutter to disable the smaller drones that swarmed around her. The battle raged on, each moment a desperate struggle for survival. But slowly, against all odds, they began to gain the upper hand. The final mech collapsed in a shower of sparks, its massive frame crashing to the ground. Ethan and Zyra stood side by side, their breaths heavy, their bodies battered but unbroken. The cavern was silent once more, the echoes of their victory fading into the darkness. Ethan turned to Zyra, a weary grin on his face. "Not bad for a human, huh?" She gave him a rare smile, her respect for him finally earned. Not bad at all. The silence after the battle was almost deafening. Ethan leaned heavily against a piece of broken machinery, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. Zyra stood nearby, her blade still in hand, her eyes scanning the cavern for any signs of movement. The faint glow of the bioluminescent fungi bathed the chamber in an eerie light, casting long shadows over the ruins of the destroyed mechs and drones. "Tell me that's all of them," Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse. "For now," Zyra replied, her tone cautious. She wiped the blood and oil from her blade and sheathed it with a practiced motion. "But they'll send more. They always do." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Yeah, I figured as much. Still, buying ourselves a little time isn't nothing." Zyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Your kind has a strange way of finding hope in the bleakest situations. We call it stubbornness, Ethan said with a weak grin. She didn't laugh, but there was the faintest glimmer of amusement in her eyes. She turned away, stepping over the wreckage to inspect the facility. Despite their victory, there was no relief in her posture, only a restless tension. "What's the plan now?" she asked, her voice steady. "Working on it," Ethan said, pushing himself to his feet. His legs ached, and his body screamed for rest, but he knew they couldn't afford to stay here. He tapped at the remains of a nearby console, hoping to find something useful. The screen flickered weakly, displaying a map of the underground tunnels. "These passages," he said, pointing at the map, "lead to an old shuttle bay. If we can make it there, we might be able to find a way off this rock." "And if the Zurhan have already secured it?" Kyra asked, her tone skeptical. Ethan shrugged. "Then we improvise. Again." Kyra's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. "Let's move." They gathered what little they could carry and set off into the tunnels. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls narrowing until they were forced to move single file. Ethan led the way, his light cutting through the darkness, while Kyra stayed close behind, her every step silent and deliberate. After what felt like hours, the tunnel widened into another cavern. The faint hum of machinery echoed through the space, and Ethan froze, holding up a hand to signal Kyra to stop. "You hear that?" he whispered. She nodded, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the shadows. "Zurhan patrols." Ethan cursed under his breath. "Of course they're here. Why wouldn't they be?" Kyra ignored his sarcasm, her focus on the task at hand. "We need a diversion, something to draw them away from the shuttle bay." "On it," Ethan said, pulling a small device from his pack. He fiddled with it for a moment before setting it on the ground. The device emitted a low beep, and he grinned. That should get their attention. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as the device activated. A high-pitched whine filled the air, followed by a burst of static that echoed through the cavern. The sound drew the attention of the Zurhan patrols, who moved toward it in formation, their weapons at the ready. Ethan and Kyra slipped past them, their movements swift and silent. The shuttle bay came into view, a massive chamber filled with abandoned spacecraft. Most were rusted and damaged beyond repair, but one stood out. A sleek, black shuttle that looked almost untouched by time. "Think it works?" Kyra asked, her voice low. "Only one way to find out," Ethan replied. They approached the shuttle cautiously, their weapons drawn. The area seemed clear, but neither of them trusted the quiet. Ethan climbed into the cockpit, his hands moving over the controls as he powered up the systems. "Good news and bad news," he called out. "Start with the bad," Kyra said, her tone flat. "The shuttle's fuel reserves are low," Ethan said. "We'll have just enough to break orbit, but we'll need to find a refueling station fast." "And the good news," Ethan grinned. "Everything else works like a charm." Before Kyra could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps reached their ears. The Zurhan patrols had realized the diversion was a trick, and they were closing in fast. "We're out of time," Kyra said, stepping into the shuttle. Ethan powered up the engines, the roar echoing through the cavern as the shuttle lifted off the ground. The Zurhan soldiers opened fire, their shots pinging off the shuttle's reinforced hull as it ascended. "Hang on," Ethan shouted, gripping the controls tightly as the shuttle shot through a narrow tunnel and out into the open sky. The sight of the stars filled the cockpit, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The vastness of space stretched out before them, a stark contrast to the suffocating tunnels they had just escaped. Ethan leaned back in his seat, a weary smile on his face. "We made it." "Not yet," Kyra said, her gaze fixed on the sensors. "The Zurhan will be in pursuit. We need to stay ahead of them." Ethan nodded, his fingers dancing over the controls. "I know a place. It's risky, but it's our best shot." "Where?" "A human outpost on the edge of Zurhan territory," Ethan said. "They owe me a favor." Syra didn't like the idea of relying on humans, but she knew they had no other choice. She leaned back in her seat, her mind racing as she considered their next move. For the first time since their unlikely alliance began, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: trust. Ethan glanced at her, his grin returning. "Guess we make a pretty good team, huh?" "Don't get used to it," Syra replied, but there was no venom in her tone. As the shuttle disappeared into the vast expanse of space, the faintest hint of a smile crossed her lips. Against all odds, they had survived. And for the first time in a long time, she dared to hope that they might win the fight ahead.